Okay, it's now getting ready to stream. And
I see that on my screen too.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All right. Mr. Collins, how are you today?
I'm doing well, man. How you doing?
Man, I cannot complain. It's been about a year since we've last spoken.
It doesn't feel that long. It feels like I talked to you just last month.
Doesn't it feel like we just spoke? It's been almost a year. I think it was February 21st or something last year. So it's been a little over a year.
Wow. It's about time.
I'm excited, man. I've always been looking forward to doing it again. And I wanted this format to be a little more, informal, allow other people to ask questions. I already have some questions that have been given, and whoever is going to be joining us on the stream tonight, I figured they'll be putting in some questions as well.
That's awesome. It was a lot of fun last time, so I imagine we're gonna have a lot of fun tonight.
I think we will, man. Hey, I just want to let you know your favorite child will be 11 years old on Thursday.
Well, actually, my favorite child will turn 30 in April.
Yeah.
My second favorite child. We ought to explain the inside joke here. But
yeah, absolutely. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter might listen to this, so
and you have to remain loyal to your child, and I totally understand that. So
Amen.
since we last spoke, we actually added another child to our family.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a four-legged child.
Oh, four-legged child. Well, at least you won't have to put this one through college.
Exactly.
And if you do, your financial troubles are over.
That is absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I am totally looking forward to this conversation. So for anybody who is just tuning in for the first time and they don't know who Mr. J.L. Collins is, he is the author of The Simple Path to Wealth, which is a phenomenal book. It really does give you the simple path to becoming wealthy and becoming happy and wealthy and rich with your money. And he also just finished another book. It is called, I don't want to get the title wrong. It's called It's a long title. How I Lost Money in Real Estate Before It Was Fashionable, a Cautionary Tale.
There you go.
Is a pretty interesting book. I had a really good time reading it, and I was able to actually do a blurb for the book because I had an interesting incident that happened involving real estate. So, hey, why don't you tell us a little bit about that book before we get started?
Well, it's very different from The Simple Path to Wealth, different subject matter. It is the sad tale of woe of the first real estate I ever bought, which was a condo in Chicago. And it's taken me about 4 decades to get over the pain and anguish and to be able to laugh about it and to tell the story. But every possible mistake you could make in buying real estate, I managed to make with this thing, and I still have the lasting scars to prove it. So the only good thing to come out of it is, well, I have a good story to tell and a new book. But it is, as the subtitle indicates, it's a cautionary tale.
Yes.
It's not anti-real estate. I've owned homes most of my adult life, but it pays to go in with your eyes wide open. And I cringe when I hear so many people talking about how easy it is to make money in real estate and what a slam dunk it is, and how it's a no-lose proposition. And if you read this book, you will find that it is very easy to lose money in real estate.
Yeah.
And this will show you how.
Hey, I would definitely recommend the book to anybody who thinks that, real estate is a get-rich-quick scheme or a get-rich-quick opportunity or anything like that. There are definitely some pitfalls, and if you don't know what you're doing, you will lose some money in real estate. And it's an easy way to lose money in real estate.
Amen. Amen.
So I actually want to, before our new guests come on, I want to ask a question that actually kind of feeds off from what we just talked about. And it actually comes from my man, Don Johnson. He said, if you could go back in time, would you even purchase a personal residence again?
Well, that's a great question. I assume this is the Don Johnson Miami Vice fame.
No, it's not. He's a JL Collins fan. He actually is very loyal to my channel. He comes on all the time.
Are you implying that the Don Johnson of Miami Vice fame is not a fan of mine? Anyway,
I would assume Don, he probably is.
Yeah. So Don, that's a great question, and I certainly at some point in my adult life I would have bought real estate, but not while I was a young single guy. And the second book, the new book that Rashad and I were just talking about, is the story of a Chicago condo I bought when I was young and single, and I was very happy renting and renting very inexpensively. And there's no question that if I had continued to do that, not only up until the time I got married, and I was 31 when I got married, but even up until the time that we had our daughter Jessica, and I was 40 or 41 at that point. If I'd rented all those years, I certainly, and just rented the space that we actually needed, I think would be further ahead financially. To me, a home it's an indulgence. And there's nothing wrong with indulgences. I mean, that's one of the reasons we earn and invest and save money, so we have the resources to have some of those indulgences in our life, whether it's a nice night out or a car or a home. But it's a mistake to think of it as an investment. And I think when the time came, when our family expanded and maybe we were thinking about school systems and a little more space and that kind of thing, that's time enough in my mind to have bought the house. And there's no question that I would be further ahead financially had I done that. And by the way, my subsequent real estate purchases were not nearly as disastrous as the first one in the book. So I say that even having some of the classic cases where I lived in the place for a while and sold it for more than I paid for it. But still, it would pale in comparison if I sock that extra money into index funds.
That makes a lot of sense. So before we bring on Joss, I want to just read a comment from Christina B. She said, "Thank you for all you do, JL. You have changed our lives. Currently reading it to my 7th grade students on Financial Fridays." That is awesome. And when she says reading it, this is the book that she's talking about, The Simple Path to Wealth. Phenomenal book. Anybody who has not read it, make sure you go out and get it on Amazon. I believe it's also on Audible right now as well. So just go ahead and get this book. It's a phenomenal book.
It's on Audible. So let me just say thank you, Christine. I appreciate the compliment. It touches my heart. I feel for your students. Whenever I hear a teacher, and I hear a lot of them these days, say that, "Oh, I teach your book in my class," or "I have my class read your book." I'm like, "Oh, it's become a textbook," So I feel for the students that it's inflicted on. But if some of the lessons sink in, they'll be well served.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So Joss, if you can go ahead and take yourself off mute and come on camera, and you can ask JL your question or questions. I can't hear you.
I can see you. I can't hear you.
Sorry. The first question I had is, and I think a few people has this question, is that they think that your book is too US centric, basically, like it's under diversified. So what's your answer to that question? Like, because especially in the next 10 years or so, how things will change in the US, like, should we concentrate more on trying to add some international?
Well, Josh, that's a great question. So first of all, my response to that is guilty as charged. It is a very U.S. centric book because the U.S. is the market I know, and investing in the U.S. is what I know. In fact, I'm kind of amazed at how well received it has been around the world, and it does have a worldwide following. And I chalk that up to the frankly, the intelligence of my readers, that they're able to take the fundamental lessons and apply it to their unique situation, even though my illustrations in the book are very, as you point out, very US centric. So, but I think your question has a second part, And that is that in the book, I talk about investing only in the US market, specifically in VTSAX, which is the total US stock market index fund. And the question, I think, is should we add international investments to that mix, either now or at some point in the future? And I am, by the way, the odd one out. The vast majority of people writing about this stuff, including people at Vanguard, will say, yes, you should have an international fund in your mix. Personally, I don't see the need for it. The US is still a very dominant economy in the world, and I think it will continue to be for quite some time into the future. And the top US companies that make up the bulk of that index are international businesses. So I absolutely believe the world economies are going to grow as they have really since World War II. They've continued to grow and expand, and I see that as a continuing process. So I see the world economic pie getting bigger and bigger, and the US part of that pie getting percentage-wise smaller, even as our economy itself gets bigger as we benefit in that world growth. But because we have that international flavor in our top companies, I don't feel the need to own international specifically at this point. Now, having said all that, when I talk to my daughter, who's about to turn 30, I tell her this is something to keep an eye on, because as that world market continues to expand and as other countries and economies continue to grow and have a bigger slice of that pie, at some point, the percent that the US represents will no longer be as dominant as it is. And at some point, I would look at a world fund. If somebody wanted to make that transition today, they wouldn't get a big argument from me. I don't feel the need just then, but I think it's something, and it's probably something that's I'm not going to have to do in my lifetime, but my 30-year-old daughter might very well have to consider it or want to consider it in hers. Does that make sense?
Yes, sorry, my son's in here.
Doesn't sound like it made sense to him.
Hey, it's interesting. I think when we spoke last year, it was widely known or widely believed that VTSAX was comprised of approximately 3,600 stocks. But if I'm not mistaken, now it's up to about 4,200 stocks.
You might be right. I haven't checked that in quite a while. There are always companies coming public, and that would be quite a growth if in fact that's the case. But I think when I was writing my book and I looked at it, and that would be around 2015 when I was finishing it, I looked it up and it was about 3,600. And as I recall, that's the number I used in the book. Wouldn't surprise me if over the intervening years it's gone up considerably. And then at some point it'll probably drift back down again, especially if we hit a rough economic patch.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hey, great question, Josh. Did you have any more questions you wanted to ask Mr. Collins?
This one isn't really as investment, but what's your opinion on, I don't know if you watched the Super Bowl, but there was like tons of commercials on crypto and, and it's just like, I feel like it's becoming even more and more popular, even though all the negative and the effects of the environment and all the other issues that are wrong with crypto, but I feel like it's gaining, it's getting very popular. So, where are we going with it? What do you think?
Yeah, so last spring, I want to say around May, Lucas, who is the guy who does the tech support on my blog, he's into investing in crypto. And at my request, he wrote a guest post on crypto. And in fact, he'd written a guest post for me on crypto in, I want to say, 2017. I don't own crypto myself. Clearly, if I'd followed Lucas's advice in 2017, I would be better off financially today than I am now. And who knows, if I were to follow his advice now or last spring, which I didn't, I might be better off several years from now. But for me, I think crypto is an interesting thing. I think it probably is going to play some role in the future. But right now it's a speculation. And I'm not a speculator. I'm an investor. And if if somebody wants to speculate in it against the idea that that role might grow and that somebody in the future will be willing to pay more for the crypto you buy today than you paid, then that's fine. I'd be very cautious, and I'd limit the amount that I committed to it. But again, it's a speculation, and people will always speculate.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about crypto with me. I know a few months back, I saw a Facebook post said Shiba to the moon. So I said, okay, Shiba to the moon. So I did my research. I put $500 in. The next day it went up to 675. And I was like, wow, I'm about to be rich. And every day since that it's fallen. It's worth like 175 now. So it seems like with crypto, by the time the mainstream hears about it, it's already reached its peak, you know. So the best time to get in, it seems, is when it's like unknown. And then at that point, like, who really finds out about it, you know? So it's just, crypto is one of those things. I mean, it doesn't pay dividends or anything like that. It's speculative, but it, you know, obviously if you get it at the right moment, then yeah, you can definitely, you know, earn a lot of money on it. But for me, it's not part of my portfolio, except for maybe I probably have about $800 in it, which is a very small part of my portfolio. If I lose it, I lose it. But for the most part, it's just not in my long-term game plan.
I think that's the way to think about it. And talking about speculation and in general, it's we have a tendency, things with hindsight work out. So as I said, looking back when Lucas wrote his guest post in 2017, you know, crypto's gone up quite a bit from that point. The problem is that you can't know that at that point. And that's true of all kinds of speculations. So people frequently think, gee, I wish I'd bought Tesla back in the day, or Apple when it was early on. But they forget that, you know, it didn't go from that low point directly to the extraordinarily high points they are now without a lot of volatility and a lot of heart stopping plunges along the way, you know, when I'm thinking of Apple and Tesla. So, you know, you've really got to get very lucky, and then you have to be willing to hold on through some pretty wild rides. And crypto certainly has provided a wild ride along the way. So it's speculation, and you're probably more likely to lose than you are to gain, but you don't hear about the losers, you only hear about the gainers. That's, by the way, the same thing with real estate, where you hear about people who bought a house and it appreciates wildly because they happen to buy in the right time in the right place. And then everybody starts thinking, well, that always happens. And my book that we started this conversation with is a story about how it doesn't always happen. And I think those stories are not told often enough, whether it's real estate or crypto or tech stocks or anything else.
Awesome. Thank you. Josh, you got any more questions?
Well, I feel like with the housing market, it seems like it's very hard for people to get away with the fact, like, you don't need a home. Like you said, it's an indulgence, right? You don't need a home to actually be able to, you know, invest. And I think it's really hard for people to kind of get away from that mindset, like, because a home for even certain people, like maybe like my parents' generation, like if you had a house, you've made it pretty much, right? So
Yeah.
I feel like it's hard for people to get away from that mindset. Like, you can still continue renting as long as your rent is less than your more, you know what I mean? And I think people it's hard for them to get out of that mindset. Like, you can buy a home in a low cost of living area and invest the rest of it. It's people trying to make that change. And I've been trying to tell people, because I live in a very high cost living area, and people are just like, I can't find a house, like everything is over, you know, ridiculous amount of money. And I've made that suggestion, you know, you can always just continue renting. The money that you would spend like a $900,000 on barely nothing, you know,
Mommy, we actually do.
invest it.
Yeah, I follow a couple of millionaires on Instagram, and they're like legitimate millionaires. They're not people that say they're millionaires, and they rent. They say there's absolutely nothing wrong with renting. It's a, you know, you can build wealth by renting and socking that money away in the index funds. It's renting. Home ownership is not for everybody.
Yeah, I actually don't fool around with investment real estate anymore, but back in the day I did, and there was a period of time in my life where I was both a landlord and a tenant myself. And that always kind of struck me as the best of all worlds. I got all the investment returns and tax deductions of being a landlord, and I didn't have to worry about my own place. And so, yeah, there are lots. And to Joss's point, a house is been drummed into us as the American dream, right? Owning your own home is the American dream, and that's not an accident. I mean, there are a lot of sectors benefit if they can convince us to own houses, including the government. I mean, in the 1930s during the Depression, the government was very, very concerned about social unrest for some pretty obvious reasons. And there was a concerted effort to make home ownership more available because the thinking was people who own their homes would be less inclined to be socially resistive or whatever. And I guess it worked because, we didn't have a revolution or anything. So, and then you go on to, all the people who sell homes and who sell furnishings for homes and appliances and repair on them. There's a lot of economic activity centered around the idea of us owning homes, and a lot of economic benefit from it. And most of it doesn't accrue to the homeowner.
Yeah.
So,
well, Josh asked some really good questions. We're going to bring Toya on. Toya, go ahead and take yourself off mute and go ahead and turn your camera on. And before Toya asks her question, Christine asked a really interesting question. And I'm guessing that Christine's an educator as well. She said, JL, is it wrong in my thinking to consider my teacher pension as the ballast in my portfolio and therefore can stay 100% VTSAX instead of incorporating total bond market fund as I move towards the wealth preservation stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now the assumption is that your pension is secure. And I imagine that as in the teaching profession, it's a pretty secure pension. So if you feel your pension is secure and will truly be there, then yeah, absolutely, it's ballast, because just like Social Security is also ballast in that sense, because these are guaranteed alternative sources of income, if you will, to the resources that your equity portfolio represents, that your VTSAX fund represents. Now, having said that, one of the reasons to hold bonds is to smooth the volatility of holding stocks. And of course, your pension isn't going to do that, at least not in any visible way. Holding bonds also provides some dry powder for you to invest in stocks when they're down. And that's something that your pension can't do for you. So you have to think, how important are those things, having that dry powder and smoothing that ride. But if you're willing and not bothered by the volatility of stocks, by the volatility of VTSAX, and so you don't need your bonds to smooth that, and you're just willing to keep putting in money every month, as presumably you have been, and that's how you're taking advantage of those drops, then yeah, absolutely, you can think of your pension as ballast, and you can think of your Social Security in the same fashion.
And hey, thanks for the answer. Christine, just so you know, I'm also doing 100% VTSAX because I expect a full pension for the education retirement system in about 11 years. So I'm doing the same exact thing you're doing. So I agree with JL. Toya, good evening. How you doing?
Hey, Toya.
Hi, how are you? How's everyone? So I will say this. I apologize. Jocelyn told me about this live earlier. I have your book. She told me about the book. I will say, I think it was on Thursday or Friday. I did buy the book. I haven't read it. I haven't read it yet. So I have the book. And she's kind of like introducing.
If you buy, once you buy it, I get paid. Doesn't matter
right.
whether you read it or not. I get paid the moment you buy it. So we're good.
So,
we're cool friends.
Okay, that's good. So right now, I'm just kind of like, so just a little bit of background for me. I am a travel nurse, and I am trying to get into finances, like, be more financially literate, I guess. So this meeting for me is more of like an eye opener. I can say that as far as like investments and all that good stuff, I am very, very illiterate, I guess I'll say, because I'm not as versed. So this meeting is kind of like giving me an eye opener, kind of like, starting to really focus on where I want to put my money, how to put my money, how to use my money to make money, basically. Eventually I want to buy a home. But I live in Florida. I don't know if I want to buy a home in Florida. So this class is kind of like, or this meeting is kind of like helping to open me up to finance.
Well, I'll start by saying I'm glad that you're open to learning about it.
Yeah.
And I will also say, and if you're new to my work, you're probably not aware of the origin story, but you're exactly the kind of person I wrote this book for. I wrote this book for my daughter. And it sounds like you and she are very similar in the sense that she really doesn't care about all this financial stuff. I find it fascinating. I enjoy it. It's a lot of fun for me. But Jessica doesn't care about it. But she knows, like you're coming to realize, that it's important, and her life will be immeasurably better if she can figure out investing. And the good news is that when you strip away all the nonsense that the financial world wants you to believe, it is the soul of simplicity, and it's easy to do. And her superpower and your superpower will probably be that once you learn the basics that I talk about and you set that machine in motion, you can go back doing the much more important things in your life, to you, your nursing, your family, and you don't have to worry about your investments because they're on autopilot. In fact, the superpower is for Jessica, because she doesn't really care, she's got it set up and it's running for her, she's not going to notice when the market plunges. And that means she's not going to get nervous. And that means she's not going to do something like really stupid and sell out at the worst possible time, because she's not paying attention to it, because she knows she doesn't have to. It's for the long term. And I suspect you'll be in the same situation if you take a little bit of time to read the book or the blog and learn those really simple basics and implement them and get on with your life. It'll be a beautiful thing. So you're exactly the kind of person I wrote it for, which is to say you're like my daughter.
Which is what I really love about your book, is that, because I think people don't realize, like, the being financial literate is just something that opened up not recently with the boom of the internet, right? Because financial information used to be accessible to only a few people, but now with the internet, we have anywhere you go, whatever, Facebook groups, just tons and tons of information. Your book just keeps coming up. People are saying, well, I don't really know how to invest. And they're like, you need to read J.L. Collins, and it's just something that we are in a women's finance group that has over 53,000 women. And that book is just like over and over. It's being like, you need to read this book. You need to read this book. And that's one of the books that comes up quite a bit. Yeah. Because it's easy to read. Because I think a lot of times people, they don't know how to, they think, well, I don't really know how to start. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to lose money if I put it in the wrong spot. Right. So I think reading the book, you explain it in a way that's easy to understand. That's not complicated with huge terms. Because that actually kind of, like, once people don't understand terms, they're just like, okay, this isn't for me, and they give up.
Right. And I don't blame them. This is a golden age for learning about this stuff. And there are other books besides my own that are very good. But when I was starting, I'm an old guy, so when I started doing this in 1975, there was no internet. I mean, and index funds, it literally, that was the year that Jack Bogle created the first index fund. So I spent decades wandering in the wilderness trying to figure this stuff out and doing stupid stuff and losing money. And that was a very expensive education. But it's a wonderful time to be approaching this now. And I look at the resources that are out there, including my own book, and I say, why didn't I write this book back then? So I could have read it and benefited from it. So yeah, I mean, it's a great time, and I'm glad. And I'm glad you and your group have found value in my book.
So one more question is, because Jessica, your daughter, even though she had interest in like learning about money, do you think when she was younger, was there any like, you know, with my kids, I'm trying to teach them, like, even at a young age, some value in it so that they can, because I find like as they get young and when they're younger, it's easier to kind of like just kind of bring information as opposed to like when there are teenagers where they're kind of like push a lot of that out. That's not important. Is there a way like to kind of like introduce some of these concepts earlier on when the kids are younger, so it just becomes something that's normal for them as opposed to trying to teach them later?
You know, Josh, there probably is, but I did a terrible job of that myself. You know, I pushed it way too early, way too hard, way too soon, and I managed to turn her off to all things financial. And she just stopped listening, which, by the way, is the reason I started writing the blog was to archive this stuff. So when the day came, and I hoped with every fiber of my being the day would come, where she was ready to receive this information, it would be available even if I was gone. And then, you know, from the blog came the Chautauquas, the annual events we do, and then from that came the book. And Jessica likes to tease me today. She says, you know, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no Chautauqua, there'd be no blog, there'd be no book. So I owe it all to her not listening to me. So I guess there is an upside. But I think, Josh, there are a couple, I can't think of the titles offhand, but there are a couple of books out there now, as you were pointing out. There's a great wealth of information on exactly this subject. You know, how to introduce your children to money. There was, in fact, a great book I read just a couple months ago, and I'm drawing a mental blank on it. But if Rashad will put it in the show note, if I think of it, I'll mention it in this conversation, and if not, I'll look it up afterwards, and maybe we can put it in the show notes or something. But it was really well done, written by a teacher, and it's what is it? Something about it's written specifically for teenagers, and it's just I think it was really a good primer for teenagers on this subject.
Would it happen to be by Dan Sheeks?
Yes, that's it exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. I can't remember the name of the book, but yeah, I'm supposed to be doing some kind of seminar for teenagers with him next month. So
yeah, he's a good guy. I met him at a live talk I did in Colorado a few months ago, and he came up and gifted his book to me, and yeah, I mean, I'm very impressed with it. So, and I forget again, but he is the author. So that's one.
Yeah, I'll drop the title of the book in a minute.
Yeah, somebody will come up with it out there.
So real quick, Colin says, Rashad, amazing that you have JL doing this. JL Collins, you don't know me, of course, but you changed my life. The simple path to wealth has made me see the light at the end of the tunnel. Good stuff. Good stuff.
Oh, that's awesome. That always makes me feel so good to hear.
Yep. Yeah. We have do you know a Rodion, R-O-D-I-O-N? He said, he gives a shout out to you. He says, hey, Jim. Let me see. Yeah, First to a Million by Dan Sheeks.
Yep,
S-H-E-E-K-S. Yep.
Exactly. First to a Million.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you, Christina. Shout out.
Is that from Christina?
Yep, that's from Christina. She's on it tonight. Tori, You got any more questions?
No, I don't, but I am still listening.
Okay, awesome. So there's nobody else right now that's hopping on. I did put the link in the chat if anybody wants to hop on and ask a question. I do have another question that was asked earlier. said, given the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the possibility of a dramatic rise in the prices of the items we depend on, I am worried about making overpayments. Sounds like she's probably doing a snowball or something like that. Things could get far worse. So would it be best to save money at this time rather than pay extra on the mortgage? And this person is actually in the UK, so she feels like she's a little more vulnerable than those of us in the United States, her words.
Right. So is the question, should she keep paying down her mortgage?
Should she pause paying extra on her mortgage and sock that money away in the savings?
Well, that's a real tough question without knowing more about her personal situation. It's always good, of course, to have an emergency fund and ready money for unexpected kinds of things. I wouldn't guess that what's going on in the Ukraine would slop over into the UK, in a way that would disrupt their day-to-day life. You never know, but yeah, I don't personally see it going in that direction. But if she'd be more comfortable building a little cash reserve, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And if she's paying down her mortgage, the only comment I'd make is when you pay down your mortgage, you're basically getting the return. It's like getting the investment return of whatever that mortgage is. So if your mortgage rate is 3.5% and you're paying it down, basically it's the equivalent of earning 3.5% on your money. So that's a way to think of it.
Good point. Good point. Good point. Good point. And I had another question earlier from a gentleman. So he wants to know what kind of percentages you recommend when it comes to monthly budgeting. And, he was just talking about how Dave Ramsey recommends no more than 25% of your take home pay on a 15-year fix and, 10% for tithing and things like that. He just wanted to know if you have any particular numbers that you recommend or if you just kind of wing it.
Yeah, I think I'm more in the kind of wing it camp, quite honestly. When I started out, from the very beginning, I saved 50% of my income. And I didn't have a budget. I just, in my first job out of college, well, my first professional job out of college, it took me 2 years to get my first professional job. It was kind of a early 70s. It was pretty bad economic time. But anyway, that job paid $10,000 a year, which of course was more money than it sounds like now, but not a whole lot of money. It was not a high income. But I knew I wanted to have money to invest. That was the single most important thing to me, was buying my freedom, even though I had never heard the term and wouldn't for decades, financial independence or FIRE or any of these terms that are common now. I just knew that I wanted a cushion of invested money. And I knew that would provide, the more of that I had, the more freedom that would provide for me. So that was my goal. And I just approached life as if I made $5,000 a year. And so when I went looking for an apartment, that was my mindset, is I have $5,000 a year and I'm looking for an apartment I can afford on that and food and entertainment and everything else. And then as my income grew, both my investing pool grew because it was still 50%. So when I was making 20,000, for instance, well, now I'm investing 10,000 a year, and I'm conveniently forgetting taxes, by the way, just for the sake of making this simple. But now I'm investing 10,000 a year, and I'm living on 10,000. So my lifestyle grew, and so that's kind of how I did it. And then when I started living on the portfolio, when I retired from my regular career, I started paying more attention to tracking what I was spending my money on. I still didn't create a budget, but I started listing what I was spending money on, both mortgage or rent, if I was paying rent, food, entertainment, travel. And I just listed those things. I was still living on that proportionate amount of money, but now I knew exactly where that money was going. So if the market were to take a major nosedive, well, and I felt the need to cut back, I could immediately look at how I'd been spending my money, and I could say, oh, okay, I'm spending a lot of money on travel, for instance, which we tend to do. That's something that I can pretty easily cut back if I need to. So it's more of awareness of where my money was going than saying I'm going to spend X percentage on housing or X percentage on food or whatever. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's kind of off the cuff, but I think sometimes people overthink things a little bit too.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's important for people to realize and people to understand is that whenever you get the various raises that you get throughout the years, if you don't allow lifestyle creep to creep in, then you just start investing that money. You live on what you were previously making. That's how you really build wealth. And that's what we try to do. You know, anytime we get our 3 or 4% raise every year, we just reallocate that money towards a pre-tax investment that it doesn't allow us to ever see that money. We never see the raise. Right. So it's just like, hey, out of sight, out of mind. We don't even think about it, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's a more aggressive way to do it than I did. But remember, I'm wandering in the wilderness in those days. So
now everything's at our fingertips. You know, if you knew better at that time, you probably would be further along than you are right now, you know?
Oh, there's no question. In fact, sometimes when I want to depress myself, I start calculating exactly how much further ahead I'd be.
And that's the frustrating part. You know, I don't know if you really listen to the Money Guys show. He's based out of Nashville, Tennessee, but they say that at 20-year-old, every dollar you save by the time they're 65 will be $88. So yeah. I look at it the same with my 15-year-old son who got his job. I make him save half of all of his, I make him invest half of all of his earnings. And I say, hey, in 40 years, you'll be 55 years old, and every dollar you save now will be between $85 and $90. So I just think that's powerful.
You know, Dan Sheeks in his book talks about, because he's talking to teenagers, and he has some case studies, some examples of some incredibly young people who are doing just that, and it's phenomenal to think of when you're starting that young, and you're not making the kinds of mistakes that I made, as I say, I was wandering in the wilderness, but you're starting on the correct path that young, and you have that much time to work to your benefit for compounding to do its magic. It's incredible to think where these young people are going to wind up and the wealth they're going to create for themselves and their families and their community. It's a pretty awesome thing.
That's incredible. I'm going to bring Zion on. Let me see.
Okay. I have a comment more than a question whenever.
Okay, go ahead.
So this is for Jen. Now, I respect your book and I respect everything about you, but if we were to talk about one of the things that I've heard that people have commented is that they feel like maybe you're out of touch a little bit, just in case, because for people, it's really hard now to live 50, to save 50% of your income. And even though like your daughter, Jessica, she like trying to learn about the finances, she still had, like you to kind of like help her, guide her. So
not that she was listening, but go ahead. I'm sorry. I said not that she was listening to me at the time, but go ahead.
But how do people to get into the market to invest when they're, is it make a difference even if it's little by little when they're living paycheck to paycheck? And I know like this book is not for everybody. It doesn't work for everyone, but I think people have to start somewhere. So I think for people, certain people, they still should be able to pick up your book, and, there's other resources too, to kind of get out of that living paycheck to paycheck. But I guess it's more like a comment of like what I've heard is people saying like you're out of touch, not realizing like people can't, save 50% of their income.
So I think, Zion, that if we had a time machine And we went back to when I was young, in the early 70s, mid 70s, and we had an audience. We'd be getting exactly the same kind of pushback you're describing. There would be a certain number of people who would be saying, that's unrealistic. You can't, in the 1970s with stagflation, nobody can possibly save 50% of their income. And certainly then, as now, I'm sure there are people who are in situations for whom it's not possible, and maybe getting to the point of being financially independent is not possible. To that, I would say every little bit that you can save and put away makes you just a little bit stronger. Just like every little bit of exercise that you're able to do makes you a little bit stronger. Even if you don't get to that ultimate finish line of financial independence, whatever there is, the journey itself is worth going through, and you will be better off by having started it even in the most modest of fashions. But yeah, I don't have the solution for all the ills of the world. And all I can do is put out a book with a formula that has worked, that talks about what's worked for me and what's kicked me in the ass. And to my amazement, actually at this point, hundreds of thousands of people have embraced it and the approach, and life changing. So I don't know what else I can say other than that.
Oh, no, thank you. There's always this glowing review about your book, but there's always, the points that people bring up.
Oh, absolutely. I mean.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I saw my younger brother actually trying to get in. I think he was having audio problems. I'm going to ask Jamal Williams, Brother Williams. Hey, Brother Williams, how you doing, sir?
Good. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing good. Good evening, man.
Oh. Good evening.
You just hopped off video. You have a question for Mr. Collins tonight?
Hi, Jamal.
No, not right now.
Oh, we just put you on the spot.
He sure did. He sure did do that.
We usually think of a question quickly. This is a test.
Zion, were you trying to ask your question now?
Hi. Not really. I guess you put me on the spot too. Thanks a lot, Rashad. I would say
that's my sister-in-law. Okay. Hey, how you doing, Sarah?
Hi. I have a question about rental property in regards to financial freedom. I do have my first house that I have. I'm now renting it out. When do you think, as far as if I were to sell it, what would be a great price range? I don't know if you know anything about rental property, but a great price range, sell it, like when it's way more, like 100% more than what I bought it for or purchased it for, or just keep it as good income, flowing income. Or
so I think the way I would look at it, Zen, is not a function of what percentage more than what you paid for, but more what it's worth today and what it is returning to you, right? So what is your return on that investment, and could those dollars give you a better return invested elsewhere? And by the way, better is not simply in this case, in my opinion, a better financial result, but it might be a better lifestyle result too, because owning rental real estate, as if you own it, is work. It takes effort. And whereas owning index funds takes virtually no effort at all. So that would free up your time that you're currently spending being a landlord to do something else, working on something to enhance your career or some sort of other side hustle. But on the other hand, if you enjoy owning investment property and being a landlord, and that's the side hustle that that works for you, then that's a value that you have to consider whether or not you want to give up if you sell the property. But I don't think I would look at it and say, oh, it's gone up 100%, therefore I ought to sell it. And now if your rents have stayed the same and it's gone up 100%, that probably means that your return on investment is not as good as it could be. But you might solve that by raising rents as opposed to selling it. So a lot of different angles to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Good question. I'm going to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, because when I'm gonna keep going then. Because when I did start it off, I was young. I was just getting out my doctorate program, and I left, and I didn't know much, to be honest.
Right.
So the rent that I was asking for was very low, and then every year usually I'm used to, they tell me, my property manager, they say, hey, why don't you raise the rent? But I always think of, oh no, I know they probably struggling. So my business side was not there. Now that I got a new tenant, I'll raise my rent up very high. And so I'm getting good income,
Right.
But it is a hassle.
Yeah.
Because they're getting on my nerves, to be honest.
Well, and that matters. I mean, your contentment with it matters. It's not just a matter of dollars and cents, right? So as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, I used to have investment real estate, and I did okay, other than my book, my second book, which is out, it talks about the disaster of my first, but I learned from those mistakes, and I did okay financially with the investment real estate, but I didn't enjoy it, and it just felt too much like work to me, and I didn't want to do that work. So I eventually sold them and never looked back. But on the other hand, I have friends who are into real estate and do very well with it, and they love it. So
yeah, I got a lot of questions in the chat. I'm gonna actually bring Jamal. Go ahead, take yourself off mute. How you doing?
Hey,
man?
how you doing, Mr. Collins? How you doing, bro?
Hey, good to see you.
Good seeing you. Good seeing you.
That's my younger brother. He's 2 years younger than me, even though he looks a little older.
Yeah, does he look up to you?
What's going on, man? What's your question for Mr. Collins tonight?
Now, we've been married 5 years, and we're really just getting into stocks and things like that. And I get a little nervous investing in stocks because I'm not sure what to invest in. I'm scared when I put my money in, it'll go down. So I'm trying to diversify. Are there really any tools that you can use to like that automatically diversify your stocks?
Oh yeah. Well, depends on Jamal what you mean by diversify. So
right here.
Yeah, there you go. So
okay.
So if you're talking about diversifying beyond stocks, right, to bonds or real estate or something, that's one thing. If you're talking about diversifying the stocks you own. Your brother was just showing his VTSAX shirt, and VTSAX is Vanguard's total stock market index fund. So when you buy that, you own virtually every publicly traded company in the United States. And we were talking earlier as to whether it was 3,600, which is what it was when I wrote my book. And Rashad was telling me that he's seen numbers as high as 4,200 companies, but whatever it is, it's a few thousand companies, and it's every publicly traded company in the United States. You could not be more diversified in stock ownership than that, which is one of the reasons that I like it. And it has the advantage of being self-cleansing. And what I mean by that is that as companies grow and prosper and do well, they become a bigger and bigger part of that index, because the index is cap weighted, which simply means the bigger the company, the more of the index, the more of it the index buys and the more it represents. So as companies grow and prosper, they become a bigger part of your portfolio automatically. At the same time, some companies are going to stumble and fall and fail. Companies have life cycles, right? Used to be Hewlett Packard was the big tech company when I was young. Now you never heard of them, so those fade away, and as they fade away,
I know about.
Yeah, they kind of drop off the index. So it's a beautiful thing that you can hold long term. Doesn't mean that it won't go down in value periodically because that's the nature of the stock market. The stock market's volatile. So you have to be committed to holding it for the long term. Jack Bogle used to say, and this kind of dates him, but it goes back to before computers where people got paper statements. He'd say, don't even open your statements. Just make the investment in the index fund, put those statements in a drawer, and then 20 years from now, open them. And you'll be floored at how much it's grown to if you leave it alone for 20 years. We were talking earlier with, I think it was Josh, and I was saying, you know, her superpower along with that of my daughter is she and my daughter Jessica don't care about this stuff that much. And so once they get set up and invested, they're not going to be fixated on it, paying attention every time it drops and
or goes up.
Yeah, so they're not going to do something stupid, right? So yeah, you got to be committed to holding it for long term. You have to understand that periodic drops, bear markets, even crashes are a normal part of the process. You just kind of have to expect them and smile and roll over and go back to sleep, knowing that in the long term, stocks always go up and they're the most powerful wealth generator that's ever been created. But if you panic and sell when they go down, then don't follow my advice. It'll leave you bleeding at the side of the road. You got to be willing to stay the course. That's
I can't tell you, Jamal, how many people I saw on Facebook panic selling right around the time of the pandemic when the stocks were down like 40, 50%. I mean, that's when you lock in your loss.
Yeah. And then you sit on the sidelines when it goes up and you can't quite believe it's going up, so you don't get back in. And then by the time you get back in,
it's too high.
Well, it's not too high, but it's gone higher than when you sold. And then it becomes harder and harder to get back in because you're like, oh, I'll wait till it goes back down to where I sold it. And that may never happen. So just
so with VTSAX, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So with VTSAX, the way they distribute it, how would they do that? The more it goes up, the more money that you put in goes towards that company, or how would they distribute your investment?
Well, first of all, that's not quite the right way to think about it. So when you buy VTSAX, you'll buy a certain, depending on how much money you put in, you'll buy a certain number of shares, however far that amount of money goes to fractional. And then you own the index. You own all of those publicly traded companies. And for each company, the percent of the total that company represents depends on the size of the company by its market cap. Market cap is just a fancy name for how big it is. It's just taking all the shares outstanding in a company and multiplying it by the price of the shares at a given time. So I believe Apple is the single biggest company in the United States these days. I think it has been for a while. So Apple is the biggest percentage of VTSAX, and it's 2-3%, something like that. And then, Tesla would be another big one, and Amazon and what have you. I have a friend who's writing a guest post for me, actually, looking at how the S&P 500, which are the top 500 companies in the US, have evolved and changed over the years. Because it wasn't always, right now it's heavily weighted at the top with tech companies because tech has been really successful. But I can remember a time when all those top companies were financial companies, and another time when they were all energy companies. And so that cycles, and at some point, tech won't be the top of the S&P 500. But going back to this idea of self-cleansing, whatever is the top, you will automatically own that as it cycles into that because you own the index. Have I just confused you, or does that make sense?
No, not at all. Not at all.
That was confusing in my own ear. So
no, I definitely followed you.
Good.
Hey, Jamal Williams actually made an interesting comment. He said, buy the dip, which theoretically makes a lot of sense, right? The only problem when I've tried to buy the dip in the past is that it wasn't quite the dip. Like it would drop further. Yeah, it kept dipping. So that's why I just dollar cost average. You know, I max out my Roth at the beginning of the year, and for the 403B, dollar cost average, whatever the price is that day, it goes in. I buy what I can when I can, because I'm just the kind of person that has bad luck with investments. The day I buy it, it drops the next day. So, you know, it is what it is with that. But I understand where Jamal's coming from as far as buying the dip.
You know,
Hey,
there was again, my memory is shot with old age, so forgive me, but there was a great post that somebody wrote about the unluckiest investor in the world or something. And it took a theoretical guy who he put in a series of investments over 20 or 30 years or whatever it was. And every time he invested, it was at a peak just before the market plunged. I mean, he had the worst luck every time, but he kept his money invested. He stayed the course. And, you know, at the end of the 20 or 30 years, he still did extraordinarily well, even having bought at the worst possible time every time. So time in the market, which I think, Rashad, was the point you were just making, is a lot more powerful than trying to time the market, which nobody can reliably do. So
Absolutely.
I think, Rashad, you're doing it exactly right. You just put the money in on a consistent basis as much as you can, whenever you can. My holding period, by the way, for VTSAX is forever. I mean, and when I die and I pass it on to my heirs, I tell them, well, the charities it'll pass on to, of course, they'll spend it, but you know, your holding period for it should be forever, because again, it's self-cleansing, and as long as there's a viable United States of America, that's what you're betting on. And I think this country has a great future. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Hey, Steve has a question. He says, how much do you recommend for an emergency fund? We have everything paid off and the house has been fully upgraded. We do have a $200,000 HELOC, 4% interest only, zero balance, that is available as well.
Yeah, I think in that case, my emergency fund would be zero. You know, emergency funds are the kind of thing that you need when you're frankly fairly poor and you don't have resources, like, I forget the gentleman's name that you just mentioned, but you know, he's got everything. His house is updated. He's got this HELOC standing by. You know, he's good to go. On the other hand, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, and you have an older home and maybe an older car, which of course those things are prone to having expensive repair needs and what have you, then ironically enough, you're going to have a bigger emergency fund than somebody who is better settled financially. So he makes a good point. It really depends on what your situation is, both financially and, you know, do you have an older house? And maybe not because you're poor, but maybe you just like older houses. Well, older houses are going to need, and I've owned older houses, so I speak from experience, they're going to need periodic expensive repairs, as like older cars do. So, but on the other hand, if you know, you have a newer car and a newer house, and especially if you have access to money that you can borrow at a short notice at a good rate, then an emergency fund isn't necessary.
Okay.
At this point in my life, I don't have one.
Gotcha.
There was a time when I did.
Yeah.
But in fact, when it was the only thing I had.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, good stuff. I just had another question from Nicholas. He said, love your book and blog. What are your thoughts about using VFIAX for tax loss harvesting when selling VTSAX at a loss? Also, how do you save for big purchases like a new car for a short time?
So the first one, and I'm 95% sure I'm right about this, is the S&P 500 index fund.
I believe that's what it is. Yes.
VFIAX. I'm pretty sure we're right about that. So what he's talking about, so VTSAX is the total stock market index fund. And the other one, and I won't, is the S&P 500 index fund. And these two funds are very, very similar because, as we were talking about with Jamal, I think it was, because the index is cap weighted, the vast majority of the total stock market index fund is in the S&P 500. So these funds are very close together. And in fact, if you graph their performance over an extended period of time, the two lines are pretty much in lockstep. So periodically I'll get a question, for instance, that, well, my 401k doesn't have VTSAX, but it has the S&P 500 fund. Is that okay? And my answer to that is absolutely, that's okay. It's the difference is negligible. So understanding that, what he's talking about doing is maybe you own VTSAX and the market has taken a plunge and you have a paper loss in your holding, and there is a tax value to capturing that loss, right? Because now you have a loss that you can use to offset other gains on your tax return. If you don't have other gains, you can take $3,000 of it every year off your earned income, and you can carry that loss forward year to year until it's used up. So just recently, we've had the market has dropped pretty significantly. So the strategy would be to sell VTSAX, capture that loss on paper. Now, the IRS says you can't buy VTSAX back for 30 days, or they consider what's called a wash sale, and they'll disallow the loss. So but you don't want to take the risk of being out of the market for 30 days because that might be the 30 days it skyrockets. So he's saying, what if I sell my VTSAX and go into the S&P 500? And that's a great strategy. That's a smart thing to do, is to capture that loss in that fashion. And then you can either just stay in the S&P 500 because it's a perfectly fine fund, or once the 30 days is up, you can switch back to VTSAX.
Awesome. Great question and great answer.
That is a great question. I don't know about the answer, but the question is good.
And the second part was, where do you save for the big purchases for a short amount of time?
Yeah, if you're, you should not be investing in the stock market unless it's for the long term. And long term, in my view, is about 10 years, certainly no shorter than 5 years. So if you're saving to buy something within the next 5 years, whether it's a car or a down payment for a house or whatever, I think it probably is best in cash and in a money market fund or a bank account. If you want to take a little more risk for a little more return, you might go into a bond fund. Bond funds, of course, can go up and down, so you might lose a little bit of money, but they're pretty stable. They're not as volatile, not nearly as volatile as stock funds. The other thing you could do, if you have some flexibility and you want to take a little more of a risk, is you could say, well, okay, maybe I want to buy a car in 5 years, so I'm going to save for that car. But if I can't buy the car in 5 years, I could wait for another year or two. Well, at that point, maybe you do a blend of cash and stocks. And if you get lucky and the wind's at your back and the market goes up in those 5 years, maybe you're buying the car in 4 years instead of 5. But you have to be prepared that if the wind turns and is in your face, you might have to wait 6, 7, 8 years to get that car. So it depends on how fixed you are on wanting whatever it is at a particular point in time.
Great. So I have another question from Sheila. She says, brokerage versus IRA versus 401k for FIRE. Now, it seems to me like the best strategy would be the 3-bucket approach. But what do you think about what her question was?
Well, if by brokerage, I'm assuming she means a regular account with no tax advantages.
Yeah, no pre-tax and no post-tax advantages.
Yeah, so I think my approach for most people would be to max out your tax advantaged accounts first. So you'd max out your IRA first, and then assuming you have a 401k at work, you would max out the 401k. Actually, the first thing you would max out would be the 401k up to any company match, because that company match is free money. Then I would go to the IRA. Then I would go back and do the rest of the 401k. Now, practically speaking, you're not doing it that way. Practically speaking, you're figuring out how much you have to invest. So I think, what's the limit on IRAs now? $6,000?
6, it's still 6, and I think 7,000 if you're over 55 or
So let's
something
call
like
it
that.
6. So you've got 6 to go in the IRA, and the limit on 401ks is 18, or has it gone up?
It's gone up from 19,500 to 20,500 for 2022.
Oh, okay, great. So let's say you've got 20,500, you can put in your 401k, and you've got 6,000 put in your IRA, and you've got, that's 20,000, that's 26,500, and you've got 26,500 to invest. I think that's where it goes. If you have 20,000 to invest, you put the 6,000 in the IRA, and then the balance in the 401k, making sure you capture all the match.
Okay.
Most companies match to a pretty low level. And then if you have money beyond those limits, beyond that 26,500, then you can invest it in an ordinary account that doesn't have any tax advantages attached to it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great thing to do. And for most people who are serious about achieving FI at a young age, their savings rate will be to the extent that they're going to have excess money to invest after they've maxed out the tax advantage stuff, right?
So even outside of these 3, investment vehicles she spoke about, wouldn't you agree that the most powerful wealth building tool actually is the HSA? If you have the ability, if you have access to an HSA through a high deductible insurance plan, since it's triple tax savings, triple tax benefit.
They are a great thing, and certainly that should be in the mix if it's available to you. Again, I forget what the limits are. They're fairly low, so it's not a game changer from that point of view. But it is certainly, it certainly has the most benefits of anything that's out there.
Yeah, I think it's about 7,900 now for a family.
Is it up to 7,900? Yeah.
We take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have access to that, that's something to take advantage of.
So Dale J asks, have you gotten any pushback on the whole your house is not an investment in these times of exploding house prices?
Well, long before these times of exploding house prices, I've gotten pushback on that. That is, he's referring to the single most, I won't call it popular, the single most read post on my blog is a post called "Why Your House is a Terrible Investment." And the irony of that, from my point of view, is I had gone to a fundraising dinner, and I was sitting at a table at this dinner with a woman who was talking about how she's trying to pressure her I think like 19-year-old to buy a house. And so anyway, I after that dinner, I dashed off this post, kind of tongue in cheek and humorous, and never dreaming what a firestorm it would ignite. So it is the post that has both generated the most hate and the most love for me, depending on which side of this particular debate you're on, because your home ownership is the American religion. As we talked about, the American dream. I think it was Josh who was talking about it being the American dream, and it is, I think, more than that. It's the American religion. And for those people who believe in it, you're treading on sacred ground, and you will pay the price. There was a James Altucher wrote a column about this years ago, and he's a New Yorker, and he said, you can you can get a soapbox and go to a Times Square in New York and climb up on your soapbox and say the most vile things that your imagination can come up with about Jesus Christ, and people will ignore you and walk around you and not pay any attention. You get up on that soapbox and suggest that owning a house is less than ideal, people began gathering stones. So that's the American religion, and I have been on the receiving end of those stones for my stance on it.
Funny, that's funny, and I've seen some comments about that prove what you just said.
Yeah.
Angel Meyer says, I'm aggressively paying down debt. Do you recommend paying down debt at the same time as investing, or debt first, or at least bad debt? Great question.
That is a great question, and I have a chapter in the book on debt. I think a two-part answer, really. I think fundamentally, I loathe debt, and to me, having debt is like being covered with leeches that are sucking your blood. It's disgusting. It's draining. And why anybody would tolerate having leeches on their body is beyond my imagination. And of course, nobody would. You take out your sharpest knife and you start scraping those little suckers off. That's the way I feel about debt. Now, having said that, if you want to get a little more sophisticated about it, and we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about paying down a mortgage early, I made the point that if your mortgage rate is 3.5%, as an example, and you're paying it down, essentially you're getting a 3.5% return on your money. So if on a calculated basis, you want to say, I've got debt at 3.5%. Long-term, VTSAX, we're actually being more specific, the S&P 500 long-term, and I'm talking about like the last 100 years, has returned on average about 10%. And that's, by the way, through the Great Depression, through a couple of world wars, through stagflation, through the dust up we had in 08. So this was not some perfect period of time by any means. It still returned 10%. But of course, it never returned 10%, or I think maybe 1 year out of that 100, it actually returned 10%. So some years it returns much more, sometimes much less, but on average. So somebody might look at that and say, you know what? Rather than pay down my mortgage at 3.5%, I'll just keep paying whatever I have to, and I will invest for the long term in the stock market. And on a long-term basis, that would probably be a fairly smart thing to do. In my book, I kind of say, if your interest rate is 3.5% or less, you're probably better off hanging on to that debt and investing the difference. If your interest rate is 5.5% or more, that's a guaranteed return no matter what happens in the world. And I think I'd pay that debt off. And again, just because I loathe debt. If your debt is somewhere between that 3 and 5% range, I think it's really a personal choice rather than the financial one. I mean, for me, I'd probably pay it off just because I don't like leeches.
I understand. I understand. Let me see. I got Chris that came into a windfall and want to put in the market. My work 401k allows a mega backdoor Roth. Pros and cons of DCA into mega backdoor Roth versus regular brokerage account.
So I'm not up to date on mega backdoor Roths, and I want to say I think the tax laws have changed on those recently, or maybe that was just pending legislation. So I'm not feeling qualified to really talk about that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I don't know much about mega backdoor Roths because I'm not at that point yet. We're able to do the regular Roths, but if I'm not mistaken, you put it in pre-tax and then you pay the taxes on it and convert it to a Roth or something. But I don't want to speak on it either if I don't know much. Let me see. Christina said they're trying to get rid of the mega backdoor Roth.
Okay, so they haven't done it, but they're trying to do it.
I've heard that before in some different financial groups I'm a part of.
Yeah,
So.
I wasn't sure if they've gotten rid of it or there's just a lot of talk about it. So.
I got another question that says, should I set up my tax account with average cost or set up the account where you can sell specific shares for TLH?
So this is something, because of the way I invest, I never really think about. What she's talking about is when you open an account with Vanguard or any other brokerage, and you buy a fund, whether it's VTSAX or some other fund, they will probably ask you how you want your shares to be treated if you sell them, whether you take the average cost per share Or you can choose to say, okay, if I sell, I want to sell the first in first, or the last in first, and it's last in first out, or first in last out. And I just take the average, and because I don't trade, I think if you were trading, this would probably be an issue that you'd want to look a little more closely at. But I think if you're trading, you're probably making a mistake. So.
Gotcha.
And by the way, what's going to happen, and I'm thinking about the previous question where we were talking about the S&P 500 fund and VTSAX and the tax sale loss. So let's suppose you own VTSAX and you want to capture some of the loss, but you don't want to sell it all. And you have the average cost per share. What's going to happen is when they sell it, you're going to have some long-term loss and some short-term loss that you're going to carry forward. And there's nothing wrong with having both. So yeah, that's another reason I don't worry about it.
Got it. Got it. So another question asked about taxes. So when you're calculating FI, is there a good percent to expect to take out for taxes? 25%, 33%, or is it just too varied to give any general guidelines?
So this is for, I'm not quite, taxes taken out of
just calculate, just putting taxes to the side. So once you're financially independent and you're just living off of your portfolio, how much should you calculate to put away? Is it like a general 25%, or should you just, is there a particular amount that you need to?
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. I've never thought about it in those ways. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, you have $1 million invested, and using the 4% rule, that suggests that you can pull $40,000 a year to live on, and your money will last. Well, from a practical point of view, VTSAX pays, I think it's lower now, but it pays around a 2% dividend. So let's call it 2% for the sake of argument. I think it's something less at the moment because stock prices are high. But let's call it 2% to make the math easy. So what you would really do is you would tell Vanguard, okay, I don't want you to reinvest my dividends anymore. I want you to pay them out to me. So those dividends would go into your checking account or wherever you told Vanguard to put them. So that's 2% of the 4-year drawing. And then you would go to Vanguard and you would say, okay, I also want to sell however many shares you needed to sell to come up with $20,000, the other half of the 40,000, right? The other half of the 4%. So 4% of $1 million is 40,000. You're going to get 20,000 of that roughly in your dividend. And then you're going to have to sell some shares to make up the other 20,000. And those shares, if you held them for a while, probably are going to have a capital gain associated with them, right? So you're going to wind up paying tax as ordinary income on the dividend, because that's how dividends are taxed. And then you're going to wind up paying a capital gains tax, which is less on the shares that you've sold. Now, all of that is assuming, taxes are always complicated, so forgive me, that's assuming you own this in a taxable account. If you're taking the money out of an IRA or a 401k, then it doesn't matter if it's capital gains or taxes or dividends. You don't have to tell them to start sending you the dividends, because everything that comes out of those accounts is treated as ordinary income. And so you would be taxed at your ordinary income rate. So if $40,000 were your total income, your tax liability would be very low, because your standard deduction is $12,500 now. I think for a couple it's $25,000.
Something like that.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I would think about it. But
so for simplicity's sake, you at that point, you, instead of saying, hey, pay me the dividends and then I'll also take 20,000 out, when you just say continue to reinvest the dividends and I'll take 40,000 out?
Well, probably not, because it would just be you'd just be recycling it. In other words, you'd be investing money that you just took out right away.
Okay.
So the simplest thing, and this again, we're only talking about a taxable account now. So the simplest thing would be to say, hey, I've got $1 million in my taxable account, and I want to start drawing 40 grand out of it, and the dividend, I'd say start sending me my dividend. And let's, for the sake of argument, the dividend was 18,000, because as I say, I think it's under 20. And then I say, okay, now I need another 22,000 to make my 40, and then I'd sell those shares, and Vanguard would then calculate whatever capital gain or possibly capital loss on those shares, and they'd give you a 1099 at the end of the year that would lay all of that out, and that's what you report to the IRS. But there is, as we're talking here, an important thing occurs to me that a lot of people don't think about. If you have an IRA or a 401k that is, and this doesn't apply if you have a Roth, then you funded those things with money you've already paid taxes on. So that grows tax-free, and when you take it out, it's tax-free. But if it's a regular IRA or a regular 401k, you have gotten a tax deduction from your contributions over the years. But that doesn't mean that you're never going to pay taxes on it, because when that money comes out after you're 59 and a half, you will be taxed at your ordinary income rate, whatever that is at that time, right? The theory is that you're probably in a higher tax bracket when you're working and earning money than when you're retired, and your salary goes away, and presumably your tax bracket will drop, and that 401k and IRA money will come out and be taxed at a lower rate. So that's the theory behind doing this. But it's important to understand that it will be taxed. And so if you're looking at $1 million in your IRA, as an example, you really don't have $1 million, because you are going to have to pay the government some portion of that as it comes out. And what portion that you have to pay on that depends on whatever tax bracket you're in when that happens to come out.
Yeah, those are some really good points. And when we calculate net worth, it's funny because you don't take that into consideration. You just see all of these 401k and 403b numbers, but you really have to, let's say 25% less than you think you have in there is really what your net worth truly would be.
Yeah, well, I think 25% would be a pretty aggressive deduction, assuming that for most people, when you're retired, your tax bracket's probably going to be less than 25%, your effective tax bracket. But it's not nothing. And I don't think people should worry about this. I think, I never bothered to try to calculate what percentage of my IRA was actually going to go to the government and not, because it's almost impossible to calculate because there are too many unknowns for when it comes out.
Yeah, right? And the laws change all the time anyway.
Yeah, but just bear in mind that there is that. I have a blog post, and it's a chapter in the book called RMDs, which stands for Required Minimum Distributions. RMDs, the ugly surprise at the end of the rainbow, which is when you get to a certain age, the government forces you to start taking money out of these accounts because they want their cut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because otherwise people will just keep it in there forever, right. Pass it down to their family.
Exactly.
So I had another question. The question was, is there anything you'd recommend young investors do as a hedge against inflation in this current environment?
So actually, I think stocks are a pretty good hedge against inflation. Inflation is when the price of goods and services increase. And when you own stocks, you own a piece of companies. When you own VTSAX, as an example, you own a piece of every publicly traded company in the United States. And those companies have assets, and those companies sell products. And those assets and the price of those products will rise with inflation. So, and that's what inflation is basically, is when the products that we buy and the services we buy rise in price, that's inflation. So Apple Computer, for instance, as inflation rears its ugly head, which it is doing at the moment, Apple's costs around making an iPhone, as an example, are going to go up. Their labor costs, their material costs, and they in turn are going to raise the price of that iPhone. And that's inflationary if you're the one what's inflationary in general, and it's painful if you're the one buying the iPhone. But if you're the one owning Apple stock, you are now protected from inflation because your investment in Apple stock, your value of your Apple stock will rise with inflation. So it's a good inflation hedge. So yeah, I think just keep investing in your stocks, and they don't keep pace exactly moment to moment with inflation. There can be a lag, but over time, owning American businesses, which is what you own with stocks, is a pretty good inflation hedge. It's hard to think of one that's better.
Awesome. Great answer. So I saw Jamal Williams had his hand raised. I don't know if it was by mistake. I'm gonna go ahead and ask him to unmute. And if he has any questions, he can ask his question.
Hey, first of all, man, first of all, this has just been amazing information. Thanks for Shar for setting this up. I'm over here taking notes. I had a quick question, and it's again around finances and financial literacy. What are your thoughts on the creation of a family trust? It's something that we have kind of kicked around, looking at family members and then at family past, percentage of probably the policy would go into the trust and kind of create generational wealth. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I'm not an expert in trusts, first of all. I am all in favor of generating generational wealth. In fact, I have a post on that. I think it's titled, it's one I wrote a few years ago, but it's investing for 7 generations or something. And I came up with that, by the way. Native Americans have, not all Native Americans, but some Native American tribes have a concept of making decisions bearing in mind the impact it will have 7 generations out. This is usually talked about in terms of environmental kinds of considerations, right? So, that's the reason you don't hunt all the buffalo to extinction, right? You want to think about 7 generations out. And the same thing applies to investing. You want to think about 7 generations out. Whether or not you need a trust for that really depends on a lot of complexities in your personal situation and your personal family situation. I wrote a book called The Simple Path to Wealth. So simple is my default. I try to keep things as simple as possible in my investments and how I go about my financial affairs. So for us, most of what we have that will transfer to our daughter will transfer by designating her as the beneficiary. So with Vanguard, and most of our wealth is held at Vanguard in VTSAX, those accounts, you select a beneficiary, and on your death, whoever you have selected will receive that money. And by the way, this supersedes your will. So if your will says, if my will says I'm going to give my IRA to Rashad, but I put Jamal as my beneficiary with Vanguard, well, Rashad's out of luck. Jamal's going to get the money. So and we do have a will, by the way, but that's the first step, is making sure that your beneficiaries on these accounts are what you want them to be, and that you update them on a regular basis. But whether or not you need a trust really depends on the complexity of your personal situation.
Good question. Good question, Jamal. Any more questions, Mr. Williams? I think he's.
I'm sorry. I got no other questions. No, I just appreciate that. Like I said, and 2 things. I think I dropped it. If you could drop the ticker for your fund in the chat or provide that. And then what was the other book you said? You said the simplest way to wealth?
This is it right here, Jamal. It's called The Simple Path to Wealth. Can you see that?
Simple Path. Okay, perfect. I got it. And then
come on, pick it up. I'll let you hold it, man.
No, I need my own. I need to make my own notes. Hey,
well, I like the way he thinks.
We need, right. We want to be owners, not borrowers, right?
Well, actually, what I would say is go get it from the library. and read it from the library. And then if you want it as a reference book, you can buy it. You know, if you want it as something you're going to mark up and refer to a lot. But I'm all for doing things free first, including my own book.
Well, I mean, it's been some great information. And the thing about JL can go on all day. We can sit here, be here till midnight.
Oh yeah, we can talk about this, you know.
We can chop it up. But
absolutely.
Hey, before you leave, man, why don't you just talk about the concept of FU money? I know people don't expect to hear FU money, but what is FU money? I have my own thoughts about what that is, but what is it in your personal viewpoint?
Well, first of all, if we're going to talk about that in the show notes or whatever, you should put a link to my now infamous.
I will.
John Goodman, with a warning that it's not suitable for work, not suitable for young ears. If harsh language bothers you, it's not something that you want to listen to. But it's 97 seconds of a fun way to sum up my investment philosophy around FU money. And of course, people can figure out for themselves what the F and FU stands for. I first came across the concept, you know, we mentioned earlier that I was kind of wandering around in the wilderness when I started because there was no internet. There wasn't the availability of information that we have today. But I came across in a novel by James Clavell called Noble House. It's part of his series that started with Taipan. Great books, by the way, fiction. But he has a character in there, and her ambition, this particular character, her ambition is to have FU money. And by that, she means enough money that she can do whatever she wants, and she never has to take nonsense from anybody ever again. And her amount, by the way, is $10 million. And this was back in the 70s when I'm reading this book, when $10 million was real money. $10 million to me is way more than it takes. I mean, you can have FU money. And as we talked about earlier, I forget the lady's name, but you know, as I said, that even when the moment you start saving and investing, you're a little bit stronger than you were before. You can afford to be a little bolder than you could the day before, even before you get to that magic financial independent number, whatever that number is for you. So FU money is that money that you just keep accumulating that makes you stronger and more able to say, you know what, I'm only going to do what I want to do, and I'm only going to work for people that I want to work for or with that I respect and who respect me, and in work that I find rewarding and satisfying. And that's hard to do when you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're just trying to pay the rent. You know, you need some power behind you, and that power is money. Money is the most useful tool, the most powerful tool that we have in this modern age. And my friend Christy Shen, who wrote Quit Like a Millionaire, and I'm going to butcher her quote, but you'll get the essence of it. She says something effective: if you understand money, life's incredibly easy. If you don't understand money, life's incredibly hard. And that's so true. And of course, if you understand money, you can begin accumulating your own FU money. And the more you accumulate, the stronger a position you're in. And I have had countless people at this point who have followed the simple path and have said to me, you know, I don't necessarily quit my job, but you know, suddenly I can be more demanding, and they respond. I've had lots of people say, you know, I hit my number and I went and I said I quit, and suddenly, you know, all those things that they couldn't do for me before, well, suddenly now they can do them, right? And so it's power.
And that's a great point. So I always tell people the two most powerful days of my wife and my family's financial life is the day we got into the black. So the day we got to a $0 net worth, believe it or not, was the most powerful day
Absolutely.
I've ever had in my life.
100%, I believe that.
And the second most powerful day was the day that I walked into work debt-free. I felt like a better employee because I didn't have all this weight on my shoulder, you know?
That's right.
I felt like I was working for my family. I wasn't working for the credit union or Bank of America or Chase or anything. So guys, whoever's listening to this, get out of debt. That's the first step you need to take. Do a budget,
Amen.
whatever you need to do, and just
Amen.
get out of debt, man, and you know, work on building that generational wealth. JL, go ahead, man.
By the way, before we cut away, here's the silver lining. If you have debt, here's the silver lining. When you commit to getting out of debt, that means that you have to set aside a certain percentage of your income to pay that debt off. And when you do that, you create a certain discipline of living on less than you're making and diverting that money to something more useful than letting it fritter away. And in this case, paying down your debt. That's painful because it's your money going off to somebody else, you know, to your creditor. But once that debt is paid off, you now have this habit and this discipline of not spending everything you make and of diverting that money to someplace else, somewhere more useful. And once your creditors are gone, once you no longer have that debt, it's an easy thing to divert that money to your own investment accounts and to begin building your own wealth and your own FU money and your own power.
Great point. And once, you know, we were at a point where we were paying $4,000 a month or so towards debt payments during our snowball period. And when you pay that all off and now you're able to reallocate that towards putting it into your own investments, man, you become wealthy quick.
Yeah, exactly. And the discipline's there, right?
Yeah.
You've done the hard work of changing your lifestyle so you can free up that money. You know, that's the hard work's done. You're just shifting it to something that's a lot more. Of course, it's fun to watch your debt diminish, but I think it's even more fun to watch your wealth increase.
Absolutely. And then you start kicking yourself for not doing it 10 years earlier.
Amen.
Well, hey, Josh, I appreciate you dropping the link to his blog in the chat. I went ahead and put it into the YouTube chat. I also put in a guided meditation for when the stock market is dropping. That's a very important video that I've watched multiple times. It has allowed me to be calm and just kind of chill out whenever I see the market.
And there are no bad words in that one. So you can
you can play that one at work. You can play that one when you're putting your baby to sleep.
That's right. You can put your baby to sleep with that one.
Well, hey, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We had a lot of people in the chat tonight. I appreciate you all. I appreciate you all for your questions. It's been an amazing night. We'll probably look at doing this once a year, right, JL?
Hey, I'm up for it if you're up for it, you know.
All right. We'll definitely be doing this again.
What was the name of that fiction book that you just talked about FU money? I missed it.
Yeah, well, it's not about FU money. There's just a character in it who referenced it. It's called Noble House.
Oh, okay. Noble House. Okay.
Yeah, it's by James Clavell, and it was published sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. It's part of a trilogy, and the first book, I think it's the last book, and the first book in that trilogy is Taipan, which is actually a better book, I think, but the reference to FU money is in Noble House.
Awesome. Let me see. There's one more message. Let me see. Oh, thank you, Tora, for the compliment. She said, great conversation. Thanks for having me. A bunch of good positive comments in the chat on YouTube as well. And you can go back and watch that later. But hey, guys, if you watch this video, if you think you got anything positive out of Mr. Collins tonight, please share this video with as many friends as you possibly can. I know we went on almost close to 2 hours. Like I said earlier, we could have gone longer, but nobody has over 2 hours to spend.
Wow, did we go 2 hours?
We went almost 2 hours. I had a few technical difficulties.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Absolutely, man. It's been phenomenal. And you all, if you want to see our original interview that we did back in February of 2021, it's one of the first videos. I think I'm at about 70 videos now. I think it's like number 8 on my channel. So go check that out. It's had like over 250 likes, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it's been phenomenal. Great feedback. And I'm just elated to have you back tonight, JL. I really appreciate it. Do you have any closing words?
I would just say it's been entirely my pleasure, and my thanks to everybody who tuned in and all the great questions. I appreciate it, and it's always fun coming back to hang out with you.
Awesome, man. We'll be in touch soon, and you give that family my love, okay?
Likewise, and my second favorite child.
I will. I'll tell her you said a happy birthday.
I will.
All right,
man.
All right. You